From New York, this is Democracy Now!
We kind of frame narrative around disease outbreaks as something foreign, like an encroachment from outside that invades us, and kind of posits us as sort of these passive victims. But actually, and I think that really obscures the larger story, which is that there's a lot of human agency involved in how we're turning microbes into pathogenic and pandemic-causing pathogens.
It's time to tell a new story about coronavirus. Our lives depend on it. As the United States shatters its record for COVID-19 and Texas and Florida report their highest death tolls of the pandemic, we'll speak with science investigative journalist Sonia Shah. Then to Yemen, where UNICEF is warning children face deadly hunger and aid shortages as the COVID-19 pandemic spreads.
When there was a spike in the deaths because of the coronavirus and other diseases, the workers were not able to keep up with the digging, the burial, and the finishing of the graves.
This comes after years of U.S.-backed Saudi bombing in Yemen that's created the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And as the Center for Disease Control says, unhoused people living in encampments should be allowed to remain where they are to help stop the spread of COVID-19, we go to Philadelphia, where the mayors postponed the eviction of an encampment planned for this morning.
Housing is dignity.
Housing is dignity.
And we demand that Philadelphia house their homeless.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United States has shattered its own record for COVID-19, confirming 75,600 cases of the disease on Thursday, as Texas and Florida both reported their highest death tolls of the pandemic. Speaking in an online forum hosted by Facebook, top U.S. infectious disease expert Dr. Anthony Fauci said the record spike in infections, which is the worst in the world, resulted from states rushing to reopen their economies too quickly.
You can't jump over steps, which is very perilous when you think about rebound. And the proof of the pudding is, look what's happened. There really is no reason why we're having 40, 50, 60,000, other than the fact that we're not doing something correctly.
Fauci was speaking with Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg. Dr. Fauci said the U.S. economy will continue to suffer unless the virus is brought under control through simple measures like mask wearing, avoiding crowds, and practicing social distancing. In Colorado, Democratic Governor Jared Polis issued a statewide mask mandate Thursday, a week after refusing public health officials' pleas to require facial coverings in public. Arkansas Republican Governor Asa Hutchinson issued a similar mask mandate. In Georgia, Republican Governor Brian Kemp has filed a lawsuit seeking to overturn an Atlanta mask ordinance ordered by Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, who is at home sick with COVID. Meanwhile, Target and CVS became the latest major U.S. retailers to require masks nationwide. Mayor Barrows is home diagnosed with COVID, as is her husband and her child. In Detroit, Michigan police arrested 11 people Thursday as they blocked school buses in a nonviolent protest demanding the cancellation of in-person classes during the pandemic. At least 600 children are attending summer classes at Detroit-area public schools, even as coronavirus infections have been rising in Michigan for the last 3 weeks. In St. Louis, Missouri, contact tracers have linked the spread of coronavirus to summer extracurricular programs, including football conditioning camps at 2 high schools. Despite the surge, Missouri high school football games are set to begin August 28th. At the White House, Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany said Thursday science should not stand in the way of reopening schools.
Yeah, the president has said unmistakably that he wants schools to open, and I was just in the Oval talking to him about that. And when he says open, he means open and full, kids being able to attend each and every day at their school. The science should not stand in the way of this.
In response, American Federation of Teachers President Randy Weingarten accused President Trump and Education Secretary Betsy DeVos of disregarding the safety of children and school employees. Weingarten told The Guardian, quote, "It's as if Trump and DeVos want to create chaos and want to jeopardize reopening. There's no other reason why they would be this reckless, this callous, this cruel," she said. In Brazil, confirmed cases of coronavirus have surpassed the 2 million mark, with an official COVID-19 death toll of more than 76,000. India recorded another record daily toll as coronavirus cases passed the 1 million mark. Several Indian states have reintroduced lockdown measures they lifted just last month. In eastern India, flooding from monsoon rains has forced more than 1 million people into shelters where social distancing is difficult or impossible. In Bogota, Colombia, doctors are demanding a citywide lockdown as a surge of COVID-19 cases overwhelms hospitals. This is Dr. Herman Bayona, president of the Colombian Medical College.
Emergency services are overcrowded. In some places, respiratory rooms are at more than 150% occupancy, and that concerns us a lot. We are very close to collapse. Even in emergency wards, there are patients on respirators that are waiting to be transferred to intensive care.
Elsewhere in Colombia, illegal armed groups have been enforcing their own quarantines in areas with limited government control, threatening civilians who fail to comply with orders by paramilitaries. Human Rights Watch reports at least 9 people have been killed for defying the measures, with some residents barred from leaving their homes even if they're sick. Back in the United States, Republican leaders said Thursday they'll scale back in-person attendance at the Republican National Convention in Jacksonville next month as Florida suffers one of the world's worst outbreaks of COVID-19. The Republican National Committee's plans call for a mix of indoor and outdoor events, with only regular delegates permitted to attend the first 3 days of convention business, about 2,500 people each day. When President Trump formally accepts the nomination August 27th, the RNC plan calls for a crowd of up to 7,000 people. A federal judge on Thursday extended a deadline for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, to release immigrant children in its custody. Last month, U.S. District Judge Dolly G. told ICE it had until today, July 17th, to release children from its family detention centers in Texas and Pennsylvania due to concerns over rising coronavirus infections. ICE now has until July 27th to comply with the order. This comes as another federal judge is poised to rule next week on a Trump administration request to keep immigrant families jailed in, quote, family detention centers, prompting fears that immigrant children could once again be separated from their parents. After a year-long investigation, U.S. Customs and Border Protection says it's fired 4 employees and suspended dozens more without pay over their participation in a Facebook group filled with racist, homophobic, and misogynistic content. In one post, a photoshopped image depicted Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez being sexually assaulted by President Trump. In another thread, members of the group made fun of a video of an immigrant man trying to carry a child through a raging river in a plastic bag. One group member commented, "At least it's already in a trash bag." In Monroe, Louisiana, a 26-year-old Guatemalan man in the custody of ICE, that's Immigration and Customs Enforcement, 46-year-old Guatemalan man, has died in a hospital where he'd been receiving care since February. Luis Sanchez Perez had been imprisoned at the Catahoula Correctional Center, where over 100 have tested positive for COVID-19. ICE alleges his death was unrelated to coronavirus. The American Immigration Lawyers Association reports at least 13 asylum seekers have died this year after being jailed by ICE. In Texas, a Houston jail is reporting a new surge in coronavirus cases linked to newly booked prisoners. Confirmed cases at Harris County Jail had dropped in recent weeks after the jail cut some of its population to ease an earlier outbreak. Nearly 1,000 people held in the jail have tested positive for COVID-19 since the start of the pandemic. In Portland, Oregon, police arrested 9 people Thursday morning after declaring their protest encampment near a downtown federal courthouse an illegal assembly. The crackdown came as acting Homeland Security Secretary Chad Wolf accused Portland officials of failing to restore order during 7 weeks of protests that erupted after the killing of George Floyd. During a visit to Portland Thursday, Wolf blasted Black Lives Matter protesters as lawless anarchists and a violent mob that desecrated and destroyed federal property. Oregon Governor Kate Brown clapped back on Twitter, writing, "This political theater from President Trump has nothing to do with public safety. The president's failing to lead this nation. Now he's deploying federal officers to patrol the streets of Portland in a blatant abuse of power by the federal government," she said. Government Brown That was Governor Brown. Videos circulating on social media show heavily armed federal officers with no agency markings snatching people off Portland streets and forcing them into unmarked cars. Oregon Public Broadcasting reports one protester ran when he saw people wearing camouflage jump out of an unmarked vehicle, not knowing whether he was being arrested or kidnapped. The U.S. Supreme Court's declined to overturn a lower court's ruling that could strip the voting rights of 1 million formerly incarcerated citizens in Florida. In an unsigned opinion, the court let stand an appeals court ruling upholding a Florida law signed by Republican Governor Ron DeSantis that requires people with felony convictions to pay court fines and fees before they can register to vote. A U.S. district court previously compared the fees to the poll taxes of the Jim Crow South. In a scathing dissent signed by Justices Kagan and Ginsburg, Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote, quote, "This court's order prevents thousands of otherwise eligible voters from participating in Florida's primary election simply because they are poor," unquote. Here in New York, hundreds of immigrant protesters camped out overnight outside Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos' penthouse apartment on Fifth Avenue, calling for the passage of a New York state tax on billionaires. A proposed capital gains tax backed by Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez would fund food and rental assistance for people who've lost jobs during the pandemic, including immigrants shut out of unemployment benefits and government stimulus funds. U.S., Canadian, and British intelligence agencies on Thursday accused Russian hackers of stealing proprietary research on the development of vaccines for COVID-19. The National Security Agency blamed a Russian hacker group known as Cozy Bear that intelligence officials accused of hacking into Democratic Party servers during the 2016 presidential campaign. The hacking claim has raised fears of growing vaccine nationalism, with countries competing to become the first with a vaccine rather than sharing research data. Dr. Ali Khan, the dean of the College of Public Health at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, tweeted, quote, "I know the Russian government are the bad guys, but I don't see this as any different than stealing bread if you're starving. Make open source," Dr. Khan tweeted. Russia has denied the claims. In climate news, new research finds a record-breaking heat wave in Siberia is directly linked to greenhouse gas emissions from human activity. The study by the UK Met Office finds temperatures in Russia's Arctic this year were 5 degrees Celsius above historical averages. The report warns of the widespread melting of Siberia's permafrost and an explosion of populations of silk moths that have damaged forests, helping to spark massive Arctic wildfires. Meanwhile, the United States is heading into a record-breaking heat wave, with forecasters warning 9 out of 10 U.S. residents will experience high temperatures of 90 degrees Fahrenheit or more over the next week. Death Valley, California reached 128 degrees Fahrenheit Sunday, just 1 degree shy of the highest temperature ever recorded anywhere on Earth. A federal judge has barred the Trump administration from gutting an Obama-era rule limiting emissions of methane, a powerful greenhouse gas. Thursday's ruling by U.S. District Judge Yvonne Rogers will reimpose limits on the amount of methane that oil and gas companies can allow to leak from drilling sites on public lands. Scores of prominent environmentalists have signed an open letter demanding a halt to all investments in fossil fuel exploration and extraction and an immediate end to all fossil fuel subsidies. They're also calling on member states of the International Criminal Court to make ecocide an international crime. The letter was co-written by Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg, who says world leaders need to face the climate emergency.
We need to see it as, above all, an existential crisis. And as long as it's not being treated as a crisis, we can have as many of these climate change negotiations and talks, conferences as possible. It won't change a thing.
In California, a 22-year-old transgender woman was found killed in an abandoned building in the city of Brawley earlier this week. Police are investigating the death of Marilyn Casares as a homicide. Casares' aunt described her as charismatic, brave, and outspoken. She's at least the 23rd transgender or gender nonconforming person killed in the U.S. this year. In sports news, at least 15 women have come forward with allegations of sexual harassment and verbal abuse against several executives and other employees of Washington's NFL team. The name is the R word. In details provided to the Washington Post, the women describe male executives constantly commenting on their looks, sending inappropriate text messages, and pursuing unwanted relationships. The team announced this week it could be changing its name and its mascot, a racist slur against Native Americans, which it first adopted in 1933. A tell-all book by President Trump's niece sold nearly 1 million copies Thursday on its first day of publication, a record for publisher Simon & Schuster. In her book, titled Too Much and Never Enough, How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man, clinical psychologist Mary Trump describes her Uncle Donald as a sociopath who grew up in a dysfunctional family that fostered his greed and cruelty. On Thursday, Mary Trump told MSNBC host Rachel Maddow she's heard her uncle repeatedly use racist language.
Have you heard the president use the N-word? Yeah. And anti-Semitic slurs specifically? Yes.
And a former game show host whose conspiracy theory about coronavirus was recently retweeted by President Trump has revealed his son contracted COVID-19. Over the weekend, President Trump retweeted a claim by Chuck Woolery, the former host of Love Connection, that, quote, the most outrageous lies are the ones about COVID-19. Everyone's lying, the CDC, media, Democrats, and our doctors. A day after Woolery tweeted, quote, COVID-19 is real and it is here. My son tested positive for the virus, and I feel for those suffering and especially for those who have lost loved ones. President Trump did not retweet that tweet. On Wednesday, Woolery abruptly deactivated his Twitter account. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show in Yemen, where UNICEF is warning children face deadly hunger and shortages as the COVID-19 pandemic spreads through a country that already faces the world's worst humanitarian crisis. This comes as medical workers say a U.S.-backed Saudi-led bombing raid on a residential neighborhood in northern Yemen Wednesday killed 25 civilians and critically injured 9 others. A local doctor treated several injured children.
The only injured victims are all children. We received 3 or 4 people and 8 martyred women and children. And today is a painful and sad day for the free Yemeni people.
The Yemen Data Project estimates the Saudi-led coalition has carried out more than 21,000 airstrikes in 5 years of war, killing more than 8,700 civilians. Most of the raids were carried out with weapons sold by the United States, and they haven't stopped even amidst the global pandemic. Meanwhile, the United Nations warning of a looming environmental disaster in the Red Sea, where a stricken oil tanker has been abandoned off Yemen's coast since the war began 5 years ago. The vessel, loaded with more than 1 million barrels of crude oil, 4 times as much oil, has spilled from the Exxon Valdez off Alaska in 1989. UN Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator Mark Lowcock said Wednesday a spill would directly affect 1.6 million Yemenis.
Essentially, every fishing community along Yemen's west coast would see their livelihoods collapse and would suffer substantial economic losses. About 90% of people in these communities already need humanitarian assistance.
All of this is happening as the U.S.-backed Saudi bombing campaign in Yemen has been devastated by conflict, leaving millions of people without access to proper health care, clean water, or sanitation. For more, we're joined by Shireen Aladimi, Yemeni scholar, activist, and assistant professor at Michigan State University. Welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us, Professor Aladimi. Can you start off by talking about the situation of the coronavirus and Yemen right now, a country devastated by the U.S.-backed Saudi bombing?
Thank you for having me back. The situation, as you said, is dire. I know I've said this before, but every time I come on the show, it just seems to be getting worse. And the reason is because the war continues, the bombing continues, the blockade is still enforced. And so with coronavirus, initially there weren't a lot of cases. There weren't any recorded cases until April. But ever since then, it's starting to wreak havoc, and we're seeing death rates that are just astronomical. We're seeing 30%, nearly 30% death rates from coronavirus in the cases that have been documented in Yemen, which is, of course, very difficult to do given the healthcare crisis and the ongoing blockade and the shortage of medicine and fuel and all the things that are needed to keep hospitals functioning.
I want to turn to the Yemeni epidemiologist Ehab al-Sakaf, who is speaking to the BBC.
The medical team knew this was COVID-19, but the authorities didn't announce it. But then the cases started to increase rapidly. The next day, there were 17 confirmed cases. The day after, another 22. Then we started hearing that people were dying in their homes.
Professor Shireen Al-Adimi, you are here in Michigan, where you teach. Your family remains in Yemen. How are they doing in the midst of this pandemic?
I mean, there's not much that they can do, given that their livelihoods depend on, those of them who are still able to work, still have to go out and work. If you're talking about, for example, protecting themselves from masks, they try to do, or with masks, they try to do what they can, but, it's not easy to purchase these things. There's a lot of misinformation. People are just not sure. Should they be taking precautions? Is this really happening? As the interviewee just said, they were certain that this was happening, but they weren't being announced. So people are still unsure about what's happening, but they're also not able to kind of take the precautions that we're able to take. Many of us are able to take here. For example, there's 17 million people in Yemen. That's about 56% of the population doesn't have access to clean water. This is drinking water. So how are they going to use soap and water to wash their hands frequently? We have 3-4 million people who are internally displaced that are in camps. How are they going to social distance? Where are they going to get water? Where are they going to get food? You have 80% of the population that's immunocompromised because they're hungry. And so, this isn't a country that's able to take any kind of precautions. So people are confused. They know that a lot of people are dying around them. We've heard of many people and, friends. My parents were, professors at Aden University, and we, received a list of all of these people who had died. Many of them were their former colleagues. We don't know for sure if it was because of coronavirus or not, but chances are, it's either coronavirus or one of the many outbreaks that are currently plaguing the Yemeni healthcare system.
Are your family members or any sick with COVID?
We did have a few family members who, again, they weren't tested because, they can't really get tested, but the symptoms seem to be coronavirus symptoms. So far, they've recovered, but, we're still keeping in touch with them, and there's very little anybody can do.
Can you talk about the U.S.-backed Saudi bombing campaign? Is it still going on through the pandemic? And what have been the U.S. measures that have been taken or not taken?
Here's the really frustrating thing, Amy. All of this is happening, and the U.S. is still helping the Saudis and the Emiratis drop bombs in Yemen. 2 days ago, 16 people were killed in an airstrike, and mostly women and children. 2 days before that, 11 people were killed in an airstrike. And so the airstrikes are still ongoing. The blockade is still ongoing. And, and this is in the middle of a pandemic. And, I can't imagine a country that has it worse than Yemen currently. It was the world's worst humanitarian crisis before COVID, and because of the U.S.'s intervention. And now it's even worse than that. And so there's a fuel crisis where people aren't, they're queuing for fuel from, sunrise to sunset. And often they're still not able to get any fuel. Those fuel, of course, is needed to run the generators, the water pumps, the ventilators, the very few hundred ventilators that remain in the country. And so this will be absolutely catastrophic. And it's all because of the root cause, which is this ongoing bombardment of Yemen and the ongoing blockade that's enforced by the Saudi-led coalition.
So President Trump vetoed legislation last year, bipartisan legislation that sought to bring U.S. complicity in the war to an end. What do you think Congress should be doing right now?
It took Congress 4 years to pass that legislation, which is frankly unacceptable, given that they all agreed that this was an unconstitutional war. This started, of course, with Obama and continued into the Trump presidency. And 4 years later, it was great that we had this bipartisan bill. It was vetoed, but the role of Congress shouldn't end right there. It was predicted that Trump was going to veto this. Of course, he has spoken publicly about the support. His support for the Saudi-led coalition because of all the contracts for the weapon, for the defense industry here. But Congress still has the authority to declare war. And I don't think that they should be giving up. We haven't had any kind of debate on Yemen for a year and a half since this bill was passed. And so I would urge them to introduce legislation that continues to challenge this. There are ways to introduce legislation that is veto-proof. And that's what they have to keep going. This can't be an issue that is discussed for a very short period of time and then forgotten about, because the suffering is just unbelievable. And we're going to have millions of people dead before I think anybody wants to do anything about it. And then it's going to be too late.
There's been a lot of blame on migrants passing through Yemen, that they're bringing COVID-19 in, without discussing the devastation that the constant bombing of Yemen has caused such a destruction of the infrastructure.
Absolutely. I mean, there is no infrastructure to speak of. Half the hospitals have been bombed. The other half are barely functioning at 10% capacity. The blockade is preventing important medicine from entering the country. There's a shortage of personnel. The health ministry hasn't been able to pay people for 2 years. And so people are volunteering in these hospitals. Like migrants, of course, they're the most vulnerable situation, because if you have to cross into Yemen to get to your destination, that's a very awful thing to have to do. And before the war, of course, Yemen was home to many migrants, hundreds of thousands of migrants from East Africa, and vice versa. But the situation right now is dire for everybody, and we can't talk about these things in isolation. The root cause here is that Yemen is under occupation. It's under bombardment. It's under a blockade that's killing, a child every 10 minutes at least for the last 5 years from preventable illnesses like cholera, diphtheria, dengue fever. A child could die from, simple fever because there's no medicine to relieve that fever. Children are starving to death because there's no food, there's no water. And so, we really have to be talking about the root causes and not think about all of these as isolated incidents.
And the problem of people already grappling with diphtheria, dengue, cholera in Yemen.
Absolutely, and H1N1. And so there are 4 outbreaks that are currently, stressing whatever remaining healthcare system is in Yemen. And now add on top of that coronavirus. And there's really no way to track it, to treat it, to supply people with the kinds of medicines that they need. There's only 300 ventilators in the entire country of 30 million people. And so, what are people going to do? They just expect that they're going to die from whatever disease is going to come at them next.
So your message to lawmakers here in the United States and to the world, Professor Al-Adimi?
It's really time to take back responsibility and for people to be held accountable for this. This is Trump's war, and this is Congress's doing if they continue to stay silent while he is perpetuating this violence against Yemenis. And the countries like Canada or France or the UK or Germany, all of these countries are benefiting still from the sale of weapons to the Saudis and the Emiratis. You can't go and say, well, we want peace in Yemen when you are actively profiting from the war in Yemen or participating in the killing of civilians in Yemen. And so I think Yemenis feel like the international community has let them down, absolutely let them down. But it's really time to, stop blaming people who are occupied and think about the people who are occupying them and bombing them and starving them to death. And it's time to put an end to all of that.
Shireen Al-Adimi, I want to thank you for being with us, Yemeni scholar, activist, assistant professor at Michigan State University in East Lansing. Next up, it's time to tell a new story about coronavirus. Our lives depend on it. That's the headline of a new piece by science investigative journalist Sonia Starr. Stay with us. Yemeni artists singing at home as part of the social media campaign #RemoteYemeniArt. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman, the Quarantine Report. The United States hit an all-time high of 75,600 new COVID cases Thursday, the largest number recorded in a single day since the pandemic began. And that number is expected to be much higher as it's increasingly difficult now to get tests across the country. In some places, in Texas and Arizona and other states, the lines are hours and hours long. Texas and Florida hit record COVID-19 daily death tolls Thursday, joining Alabama, Arizona, Hawaii, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, South Carolina, and Utah, which all saw their highest number of dead in a single day this week. As the U.S. spirals into a disaster that public health experts warn could get much worse in the fall, half of the states in the country have now issued mask mandates. But some Republican leaders are continuing to fight the basic public health measure. Georgia Governor Brian Kemp suspended local mask requirements this week and has sued the city of Atlanta and its mayor, Mayor Bottoms, for its mask mandate. President Trump has repeatedly refused to wear a mask, as he did when he landed in Atlanta this week. A University of Washington model predicts near universal mask wearing could save up to 28,000 lives in the U.S. before October 1st. Top U.S. infectious disease expert Dr. Anthony Fauci said Thursday the spike in coronavirus cases resulted from states rushing to reopen their economies, and that the economy will continue to suffer unless the virus is brought under control through simple measures like mask wearing, avoiding crowds, and practicing social distancing. Despite this, President Trump and Education Secretary Betsy DeVos are continuing to push schools to reopen in person in the fall. This is the White House press secretary speaking at the White House.
Yeah, the president has said unmistakably that he wants schools to open, and I was just in the Oval talking to him about that. And when he says open, he means open and full, kids being able to attend each and every day at their school. The science should not stand in the way of this.
We're joined right now by Sonia Shah, investigative journalist and the author of Pandemic, Tracking Contagion from Cholera to Ebola and Beyond, and The Next Great Migration, The Beauty and Terror of Life on the Move. Her new piece for The Nation's headlined, "It's Time to Tell a New Story About Coronavirus. Our Lives Depend on It." Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Sonia Shah. What is that new story that must be told?
Well, I think the way we think about infectious diseases like COVID-19 is as if they are a foreign incursion that we have to repel sort of with military might and weaponry. But in fact, we're not passive victims of these things. There's a lot of human agency involved in the infectious disease process. And I think we need to start talking about COVID-19 and other infectious diseases as the social and political phenomenon that they also are.
So talk about that. Further elaborate on what you think is the real crisis here, and that even finding a vaccine is not going to cure that catastrophe we're facing.
Right. So the way we talk about the disease, you know, that is what propels our policy responses. So if we think of it as a foreign incursion, then we want to do things like close the borders or, control people's movements who are unwanted people's movements. And we want to create these weapons, vaccines and drugs. And, that might work for older diseases that we already had under control. But when you have a brand new disease like this one, and we're already seeing this, you cannot make a drug or vaccine fast enough to protect people from the first wave. And the first wave is the most deadly wave because that's when we have no immunity at all. And we're seeing the effect of that now. Instead of spending, we should have been spending way more time and resources prioritizing collective actions, which we're having so much difficulty doing now, sort of after the fact, after we've had these huge outbreaks, we have so much virus around. Now we're trying to talk about, well, maybe we should wear masks. Maybe we should stay home. Maybe we should close restaurants. We should have been doing that early on. And I think if we had told a different story about this pathogen, that it is a social phenomenon, that it is within our ability to arrest its spread by changing our behavior through cooperative actions together, I think we might have been in a different place.
Some might say that the best vaccine for the coronavirus is Medicare for all, is health care for all. Can you fit the disparities, the racial disparities in who lives and who dies, who gets sick and who doesn't, into that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think when we spend, if we look at where we're spending our resources as a nation, where we're spending our attention, it's very much into this market-driven, proprietary vaccine development and drug development. And that serves certain interests, of course. Those companies are going to, make a lot of money, get a lot of glory for creating a vaccine. And of course, the vaccine will help us if we actually ever get one. But the people who can wait for the vaccine have privileges, right? There's a lot of people who can't wait for a vaccine. We need to do collective actions and behavior changes now. We need everyone on board. So we need to build that trust up again, and to think of this disease as something that is within our power. We are not the passive victims that we blame other people for, right? That they're bringing it to us and we need to keep them out, or we need to have weapons to destroy the microbes in their bodies. We need to think of it as something, all these microbes, they have no independent locomotion. They rely entirely on us to spread from one person to the next. So even if you have the introduction of a deadly pathogen in a community, and we've seen this over time historically, you may not have an epidemic if behaviors don't sustain it. So these are things that we have to, to rethink what our role is in the disease process.
Sonia Shah, give us a history lesson. Take us back through the contagions from 1832, the cholera outbreak in 1832, and come to the present.
So when cholera first emerged in the 1800s, it was like COVID-19 today. Brand new disease. No one had ever seen anything like it. It tore across the world. It started in South Asia, moved up into Europe, and then across into North America. And it was carried through contaminated water. People in New York, physicians, collected data showing very clearly that cholera was coming down the Hudson River, it was coming down the Erie Canal, and heading straight for New York City. But commercial interests at the time said, well, we cannot quarantine the waterways because that would be too disruptive to trade. And so public health interventions never included any quarantines of the waterways. So that was part of the resistance to controlling the disease. It was too costly to the economy. But the other part of it was that it wasn't the way they understood the disease. The way they understood diseases at that time was that contagious diseases were carried in the air, that these were carried by miasmas, these smelly clouds of gas, that if you inhaled them, that's what would make you sick. So rather than quarantining the waterways, people did things like string up sides of beef to soak up the cholera vapors, or they burned barrels of tar to repel the miasmas. In the city of London, people would install flush toilets, what they called water closets, not because they wanted to get rid of human waste and contain human waste, which was in fact contaminated with cholera, but because they wanted to get rid of the smells. And so since they didn't care about the contents of their privies and outhouses, they dumped all of that human waste into their drinking water, into the River Thames. And after every cholera outbreak, they actually installed more flush toilets to dump more human waste into the rivers and their drinking water rather than less. And so they probably made cholera a lot worse. And so we had these cholera outbreaks continuing for nearly a century over the 19th century, and thousands of people died, of course.
And then talk about how society has dealt with, for example, Zika and Ebola, and how COVID-19 is different from those pandemics.
Well, Zika and Ebola never really became full-on pandemics, of course, but as outbreaks, those are have been much more containable. But I think it's the same approach where we look for drugs and vaccines rather than looking at the deep root causes, which are, human driven. All of these things are coming out of wildlife and animals. All of these microbes live in animals and wildlife and are harmless in those environments. So we think of them as invading us, but what's really happening is we're invading their territory. So when we invade wildlife habitat,
we destroy where the bats roost, and so they don't just go away, they come and live in our farms and backyards instead. And that facilitates all kinds of novel, intimate contact between wildlife and human bodies, whether it's wildlife trade or bushmeat hunting or wet markets or, casual contact, any number of those things. We are not getting at those root causes. And so since 1940, we've had hundreds of these new pathogens emerge, whether it's Ebola in West Africa, where it had never been seen before, Zika in the Americas, where it had never been seen before, or this new coronavirus. And so this is a drip, drip, drip of new pathogens that are emerging. And it's, the underlying reasons are because of the way we're interacting with the environment and with nature. These are things that are under our control. So we need to start talking about it that way rather than, casting ourselves as sort of the passive victims of these foreign invading germs.
People, in many cases, are learning the word zoonotic disease for the first time, the spillover, the jumping from animals to humans. If you could explain that further, just what you were talking about.
So about 60% of the new pathogens that we've been seeing since 1940 originate in the bodies of animals. About 70% of them originate in the bodies of wild animals. Those are not microbes that cause disease in those creatures. So just like we have lots of microbes that live in our bodies, they don't make us sick. We have, things in our guts and they don't make us sick. They actually are beneficial to us. So those microbes are living in animals' bodies. When we come into novel, intimate contact with those animals, say, for example, if a bat, there's bat excreta around and your kid is playing near a tree and gets a little bit of bat poo on their hands and puts their hand in their mouth, the microbes that live inside the bat's body then enter the human body. If that happens again and again, often enough, that microbe will start to adapt to the human body. And like every other living thing, when it finds a new territory to exploit, it starts to thrive. It starts to adapt and evolve to live, to colonize that new environment. And so that's how these new pathogens are being born. We are creating these bridges between the bodies of wild animals and our own bodies because we're destroying so much of the habitat where they live in. So instead of these animals living in far off places where they don't encounter us very much, we are, cutting down the forests and paving over the wetlands where they would normally live. And instead, they're coming and living in our farms and gardens and backyards instead.
With the climate crisis contributing to this.
Yes, well, because of the climate crisis, we also have wild animals moving in all different places, right? We have 80% of wild species are on the move right now, moving into the heights and towards the poles. And so they are encountering new human populations as they move into new places. And those movements, of course, are life-saving for them. But it just adds to these collisions between humans, microbes, and animals. And that is the process that brings us new diseases.
Sonia Shah, before we end, I wanted to get into what you think are some solutions. For example, explain the concept of One Health.
So One Health is a concept in public health circles, and as a theoretical construct, it's gotten a lot of purchase. The idea is that human health is not just the absence of pathogens or the absence of certain kinds of sicknesses. Human health is connected to the health of our livestock, the health of our wildlife, and the health of our ecosystems. And so if we think of human health that way, then it's not just an issue for biomedical experts. It's not just an issue for drug companies to come up with new medicines and new vaccines for us. What we have to do to create good health is to make sure that our livestock are healthy, to make sure that our wildlife is healthy, and to make sure our ecosystems are healthy. So that's the idea of One Health. And operationalized on a kind of a low level, there's a lot more we can do to make the One Health approach more common, but it's starting, so it's there. And I think this is something that is a lot of promise as we move into this new era. We're seeing a lot more of these emerging trends.
In our headlines today, we covered the story of the UK, Canada, and the United States saying that Russia is trying to hack the vaccine research that's being done in different countries. I was wondering, and of course Russia is denying this, if you can talk about vaccine nationalism instead of sharing knowledge to cure the world. Countries are racing to be the first to make the vaccine and then get a monopoly on it. We just spoke to Dr. Ali Khan, who is a former CDC official and now dean of the school at University of Nebraska, and he just tweeted that if all of this were open source, then you wouldn't have the time spent on these accusations.
Absolutely. I think he's absolutely right. It needs to be open source. And, and this goes back to the whole way we think about diseases as a problem of foreign invasion. It really lends itself to these nationalistic kind of enterprises. Think, well, we need to come up with our own thing to protect our people with our weapons instead of, but what we have already seen is the only thing that is helping in this last 6 months is international solidarity. It's the fact that we understand so much about the disease because scientists in China and Europe and elsewhere have been sharing data with people, with other scientists around the world. That's what is actually helping us understand how does this thing spread from one person to another? How much pathogen do you need to have an infectious dose? Do masks really work? Does hand washing really work? All of these things we're learning because of international solidarity across borders, these international scientific collaborations, which are really unheard of. It's unprecedented, the amount of collaboration that's happening across borders right now. And that's what we need to support moving forward. This whole idea of a vaccine search that's funded through, taxpayer dollars to a large extent, and yet being capitalized and creating, that we're creating proprietary products instead, is going in the absolute wrong direction.
There's a front page piece in the New York Times today. Unproven firm got $1.6 billion to find a cure for vaccine research. But this issue of where the money goes and where the money could be better spent makes me think about Jonas Salk, who refused to make the polio vaccine, let it be trademarked. He said it must be free to all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other part of it, Amy, is that we have put a lot of faith and stock into vaccine development. And I think, I think if you look at the history of our viral threats, our microbial threats, there's been very few that we've been able to control or even eradicate through vaccines. There's only been one that we've actually ever eradicated through a vaccine, and that was smallpox. And that was actually, the smallpox vaccine was not based on a proprietary high-tech process. It was based on a folk remedy that had been developed for hundreds of years in Asia and Africa. So, this idea that we can very rapidly produce this product and it's going to save us all, I think is a little bit exaggerated when you really consider the whole history of how vaccines have been able to control contagious diseases. And almost all the big diseases we've encountered in our history, whether it's cholera, malaria, tuberculosis, et cetera, it's been behavior change that has saved us from them. It's been housing reform and social reform, sanitary reform, clean water, all of those things. Hard-won social changes that actually build us out of the contagious way of life.
Sonia Shah, I want to thank you for being with us and end with the exact quote of Jonas Salk. He was asked by Ed Murrow, who owns this patent? Salk replied, well, the people, I would say. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun, he asked. Sonia Shah, science investigative journalist, author of Pandemic, Tracking Contagion from Cholera to Ebola and Beyond, as well as The Next Great Migration, The Beauty and Terror of Life on the Move. We'll link to your latest article published in The Nation. It's headlined, "It's time to tell a new story about coronavirus. Our lives depend on it." When we come back, the Center for Disease Control says unhoused people living in encampments should be allowed to remain there, which will help stop the spread of COVID-19. We'll go to Philadelphia. Stay with us.
When I count all my blessings, my heart still hurts for the world that I know. The world that I know. Sinking down under the water, slipping down under, drifting out into the water, missing out under. Tell me what is it you care for? Is there even a care at all? Praying for sense of direction, praying for love and protection. Sinking down under the water,
Mercy by Aaron Allen Kane. This is Democracy Now!, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As public health officials plead with people to follow guidance from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to stop the spread of the coronavirus, many cities are going against these recommendations when it comes to working with people who are unhoused. CDC guidelines state, quote, if individual housing options are not available, allow people who are living unsheltered or in encampments to remain where they are, unquote. Despite this, sweeps have been conducted in New York, St. Louis, Minneapolis, Denver, and elsewhere. For more, we go to Philadelphia, where the mayor has postponed the eviction of an encampment of unhoused people that was scheduled for this morning. About right now, in fact. Philadelphia Mayor Jim Kenney said in a statement Thursday, the camp, quote, casts an important light on the racial inequities in our society that impact homelessness, and said he's committed to taking steps to provide affordable housing. For more, we're going to go to one of those encampments of unhoused people near the Benjamin Franklin Parkway and join Sterling Johnson, an organizer with Black and Brown Workers Cooperative in Philadelphia, spokesperson for Philadelphia Housing Action. Sterling Johnson, welcome to Democracy Now! Please describe for us where you are and what's happening at this encampment.
So, thank you, Amy, for having us. Right now, we are at right in between the City Hall and Art Museum. It's called the Von Coln Memorial Field. This is the James Taleb-Dean encampment. We have taken this space. We've occupied this space. It is right in front of the Parktown Plaza, where people pay about $5,000 a month to stay in there. It's a very, very open and clear occupation of land that is not meant for us.
Talk about how it is that the encampment of unhoused people managed to get the mayor not to raid and take down this encampment today. What kind of negotiations have been taking place?
So just upon setting up tents, they did contact me specifically about negotiation. We had been in negotiations for a long period of time. We had 8 demands. The first demand was to transfer the vacant homes that the City of Philadelphia and the Housing Authority, the Philadelphia Housing Authority, own into a community land trust. They refused to talk to us about those issues. They raised many other issues that were important, but they refused to talk about those. They then, we decided that we would walk out, that we needed to have one conversation, and that was about permanent housing. Upon doing that, then they started to escalate and to threaten us and to cut our sanitation contracts. We then engaged them again, and that is where we're at now. They have decided to come to the table with the actual mayor and the actual housing authority CEO to have a real conversation about permanent low-income housing.
Last month, one of your fellow housing activists, Jennifer Benich, announced they were helping unhoused families occupy multiple homes. In this clip from an interview with Unicorn Riot, she describes who owns the homes.
So we're over here right across the street from the $45 million Housing Authority headquarters where we just broke that news. And if you could look over here, these are all vacant public Housing Authority owned properties. Now, our Housing Authority, as I said earlier, is processing applications from 2010 and has stopped taking applications in 2013. But there are just vacant properties. This is 3 right here. There's 2 more down there at the end. All of these lots are also owned by the Housing Authority.
That's Jennifer Benich. She's standing in front of all these closed homes, boarded up homes. Sterling, can you tell us, what is the Philadelphia Housing Authority? How many homes does it own? How many are empty?
So the Philadelphia Housing Authority is the largest housing provider in the city of Philadelphia. They have a wait list where nobody has moved, that has been closed since 2013. They are a group that has a history of malfeasance, has a history of corruption, of using money to make market rate housing. They have a history of blighting properties. They have a history of taking Black and brown homeowners' properties and giving them, dimes on for their properties. They have a history of also putting money into their headquarters, which is $45 million, and not really focusing on the people that are around them. The Philadelphia Housing Authority has about 5,000 vacant properties right now. We want to use them to create a community land trust. What they want to do is to auction them off to private developers every single year, so they can act as a private rental company, a real estate company. We have decided to occupy those homes. We don't believe that it's a crime to place a family with small children into a home so they can sleep safely and soundly. Those aren't crimes. That's an act of love. It's really important to see what the Housing Authority in Philadelphia, and not only Philadelphia, but other housing authorities across the country have been doing to basically privatize public property. This is public property.
So, Sterling, I want to ask you about the resignation this week of the Philadelphia Mayor Jim Kenney's second-in-command, Managing Director Brian Abernathy, who faced criticism for his handling of homeless services and policing. It's been reported investigators from a police counterterrorism unit visited the home of a Philadelphia man, Jose DeMarco, who sent flower arrangements to Abernathy's house as part of a demonstration to call attention to the COVID death of a man living in a shelter and the city's affordable housing crisis. Talk about the resignation and what this was all about.
Yeah, it's very important to see the response to legitimate protests. Jose DeMarco is an organizer for Active Philadelphia. We are, a coalition of groups that talk to the Office of Homeless Services and talk to him specifically about all the trouble that people are going to have staying at home due to COVID-19. They continued to increase the budget for the police. They continued to say that they were doing what they could for homeless services. We know that's not true when they cut the budget by $12 million. We have a call to defund the police and invest in housing, invest in the people that are here, don't take federal money that's supposed to go to people experiencing homelessness and give it to the police. That's a very simple ask.
Sterling Johnson, talk about what's next. The Philadelphia mayor says he plans to meet with the encampment's organizers directly next week. Will you be there? What do you plan to tell him? You're standing in front of this tent encampment. It's not the only encampment, to say the least, in Philadelphia. And will you also be able to meet with Kelvin Jeremiah, CEO of the Housing Authority? And we just have 30 seconds.
Yes, they have both said that they will meet. Kenny and Jeremiah have said that they will meet with us. We will tell them that this is not for us. We are not the beneficiaries of this. We have a deep, deep love for everybody that is low and no income. We're not asking for affordable housing. We need housing for no income people, for disabled people. I am a disabled person. We deserve every right to stay in this city and to live peacefully.
And Sterling, how are you keeping safe? I see you've got a mask that you've pulled down just for this interview. How are folks staying safe in this last 10 seconds?
Yes, we have regular testing, we have PPE, we have hand washing, we have hand sanitizer, we have a medic tent. We care about, everybody in this community cares about each other.
It might shock people to know the CDC recommendation is that unhoused people not be moved from encampments like yours. 5 seconds, Sterling.
Of course, yes. And Philadelphia has rejected that, has told us that is one man's opinion. We have that on video.
Sterling Johnson, I want to thank you for being with us, organizer with Black and Brown Workers Cooperative in Philadelphia, spokesperson for Philadelphia Housing Action. That does it for our show. Wear a mask, stay safe, and save lives. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.